drifting in, but I figure we won't stand on ceremony. We'll just move, reward the folks who are on time, and move on. We welcome everyone and thank you to the witnesses for joining us for this hearing. We're holding today's hearing in the committee hearing room via WebEx platform in compliance with rules and regulations for remote committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 8. Before we begin, I want to remind members of a few procedures to keep these proceedings running smoothly. First, consistent with the regulations, the subcommittee will keep microphones of those present on the WebEx platform muted to limit background noise. Members are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition or when recognized for their questioning. Committee staff will mute members only in the event of inadvertent background noise. In addition, when members are present in the proceedings via WebEx, you must have your cameras on. If you need to step away to attend another proceeding, please turn your camera and audio off rather than logging out of the platform. And with that, I will turn to the topic of today's hearing on the critical and timely subject of trade and the environment. The climate crisis is here and continues to intensify. Global warming, extreme weather events, and biodiversity loss have disrupted the delicate balance of our natural world. While Congress, led by this committee, recently enacted the historic Inflation Reduction Act to ensure the United States remains a leader in addressing the climate crisis, the scope and scale of the crisis require us to do much more and to take continued action with our allies and partners around the globe. One area of deep concern is the ongoing deforestation and forest degradation. These drivers of forest loss threaten the survival of countless species and reduce the ability of forests to provide the services we critically need, from purifying the air we breathe, to providing an indispensable home for flora and fauna, to preventing erosion and acting as a critical buffer against climate change. Forest loss affects tens of millions of people, but especially local and indigenous communities whose culture and livelihood depend on these habitats. I'm proud to be one of the authors of the 2008 Lacey Act. Mr. Bismarck was active with us in that. Amendments that ban trade in unlawfully sourced wood products to deal with the ongoing problem of illegal logging and deforestation, perpetuated by some of the worst people on the face of the planet. Our legislation has helped reduce the importation of illegal timber into the United States by more than 1/3. Last October, I introduced the bipartisan legislation with Senator Schatz, the Forest Act, to deter commodity-driven deforestation by prohibiting imports of products made of certain commodities produced on illegally deforested land. I look forward to continue to work with our colleagues in the House and Senate on this legislation. I will also continue to seek to advance its objectives through international forums and American bilateral and multilateral agreements. Historically, this committee has worked across administrations to promote high levels of environmental protection through trade agreements and initiatives with the objective of furthering sustainable development. There is, however, a troubling, lackluster track record for the enforcement of the environmental provisions in American trade agreements over the years, as some of our trading partners have fallen far short of the commitment they made to protect the environment and enact the legislation. The United States needs to step up. I was deeply involved with the forest annex of the U.S.-Peru Trade Promotion Agreement, a concession that made the agreement approval by Congress possible. Yet illegal logging in Peru continues unabated, and sadly, the United States has taken enforced action against only 2 companies operating in Peru that have exported illicit timber to the United States. As Mr. Van Bismarck's testimony notes, there are several other exporters with documented illegal timber trade in the United States that have not suffered any enforcement action. Peru also has not fulfilled the important traceability commitments. The Biden administration has taken some steps with trading partners to ensure they are living up to their obligations to encourage high levels of environmental protection and to effectively enforce their own environmental laws. Earlier this year, the USTR launched environmental consultations with Mexico under the United States-Mexican-Canadian Agreement concerning Mexico's obligations relating to the prevention of illegal fishing. In July, the USTR directed the U.S. Customs and Border Protection to continue blocking timber imports from a Peruvian exporter based on illegally harvested timber found in its supply chain. And last year, the USTR announced an agreement with Vietnam on illegal logging and timber trade. But the United States can and must do more to hold our trading partners and ourselves accountable for the commitments that have been made. Independent testing has revealed that more than half the wood products introduced in the United States have incorrect species claims. Additionally, imports of wood products worth tens of billions of dollars, subject to the Lacey Act prohibition on illegal harvest, remain in practice uncovered by the Act's declaration requirements. This committee will continue to advocate for strong enforcement of environmental commitments in American trade agreements. We support continued cooperation with our trading partners to increase their capacity to tackle environmental challenges, particularly in key areas like illegal deforestation, which has a devastating impact on communities and ecosystems across the world. This committee has also supported our government's efforts to address illegal fishing, which contributes to the destruction of precious maritime ecosystems. These illegal practices harm coastal communities and workers and lower the price of American goods fairly caught. The United States imports billions of dollars worth of seafood derived from illegal fishing activities each year. The Biden administration must strengthen enforcement of trade obligations and American trade laws to combat illegal fishing and limit imports of unlawfully caught seafood, some of which are tainted with forced labor. I was pleased with the agreement on fisheries subsidies reached at the World Trade Organization's 12th Ministerial Conference, but much more work needs to be done at the WTO to curb harmful fisheries subsidies that contribute to overfishing, to conserve marine stocks, and prevent the widespread depletion of fish stocks. We know China is estimated to be the largest source of illegal, unreported, and unregulated seafood imports, representing a global threat to workers and consumers alike. This committee will continue to advocate for greater enforcement of American forced labor import prohibitions to prevent imports of seafood from fishing vessels where egregious forced labor practices occur. Finally, the enactment of the historic Inflation Reduction Act will accelerate clean manufacturing and decarbonization of emissions-intensive industries. It is important that the United States also utilize trade tools to this end. I am encouraged by the early discussions with the European Union regarding a global arrangement to address carbon intensity and overcapacity in steel and aluminum. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about how this committee can work with the Biden administration as it considers a new generation of trade policies to promote decarbonization necessary to limit global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees. I hope to collaborate with our colleagues across the aisle on what should be a bipartisan priority for us all, ensuring a livable climate now and for future generations. With that, I'm pleased to recognize Ranking Member Mr. Smith for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer, for holding this important hearing today. Certainly thank you to our witnesses. With just 17 days left this year, the window of opportunity is closing to reach a bipartisan agreement to renew two crucial and non-controversial programs, the Generalized System of Preferences, GSP, and Miscellaneous Tariff Bill, MTB. I have not given up hope on getting these programs renewed before the end of the year, but if we are to reach an agreement in short order, and we absolutely should, it will require my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to abandon efforts to use GSP and MTB as leverage for partisan priorities like trade adjustment assistance. GSP and MTB provide tariff relief to Americans throughout the country on products not made in the United States. They support good American jobs and have long enjoyed strong bipartisan support. Given the topic of today's hearing, it's important to note Ways and Means Republicans have supported renewing GSP with environmental eligibility criterion. An action Congress could take this month to improve the environment would be to advance a long-term, bipartisan GSP bill. I hope we won't squander this opportunity. Promoting sustainable environmental practices through trade policy is an important topic, and both sides of the aisle should work together to advance new trade opportunities for all Americans in ways which raise environmental standards. The Biden administration's moratorium on trade agreements puts the U.S., our country, on the sidelines while global competitors aggressively pursue markets for their products and services. This trade moratorium also severely limits options for U.S. trade policy to address harmful environmental practices worldwide. American workers and businesses already struggling with record inflation cannot afford continued inaction on trade, and U.S. leadership on trade is needed to create jobs, raise wages, and support the environment. For example, USMCA includes a very high standard environment chapter, backed up by a formal consultation process and dispute settlement mechanisms when needed. Ambassador Tai and USTR are actively engaged in consultations with Mexico regarding illegal fishing and the protection of the vaquita porpoise. Further, the United States is a world leader in the production of clean energy, including LNG and green technology. We must end the Biden administration's war on American energy production, unleash energy exports, and support our trading partners as they struggle with the repercussions of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For example, U.S. LNG is up to 30% cleaner than Russian natural gas. U.S. LNG exports can help Europe keep the lights on and heat on during this unprecedented time while simultaneously bringing down global emissions. A great opportunity to prioritize common sense energy policy through trade policy is by negotiating an updated environmental goods agreement with trading partners who share our ambition. USTR should promptly renew these negotiations to tear down barriers to additional exports of American-made clean energy products. Mr. Chairman, the cost of trade inaction is just too high. While I welcome increased U.S. engagement on trade and economic issues in the Indo-Pacific region, I fear President Biden's Indo-Pacific economic framework and other dialogues and frameworks do nothing to expand markets for U.S. exports. Further, I fear they will lack meaningful accountability if our trading partners fall short of their commitments, including environmental provisions. As I have laid out, President Biden's trade moratorium empowers China and other aggressors. There are 52 nuclear reactors under construction across the globe, but only 2 are in our country. Russia accounts for about 2/3 of reactor sales worldwide. China has 14 reactors currently under construction and has announced plans to build 150 new reactors over the next 15 years. Nuclear is one of our most reliable and one of our cleanest energy sources, yet China and Russia are doing more to prioritize nuclear than our own country. I welcome today's conversation about our trade and environmental priorities, and I look forward to hearing from each of our witnesses. As I've said, I'm eager to renew our long-expired GSP and MTB programs, which would improve opportunities for American workers and help raise environmental standards around the world. It's also important we avoid additional delay in updating Trade Promotion Authority legislation through which Congress would set clear priorities for new trade agreements. TPA would open new markets for American products and services while creating enforceable rules reflecting our values and goals, including and especially our goals for the environment. With that, Mr. Chairman, thank you again. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. I appreciate your opening statement and your optimism. I hope we are able to make some progress in the remaining days of this Congress and moving forward. It's now my great pleasure to welcome our witnesses. First, we will have Alexander von Bismarck. Sasha is the Executive Director of the Environmental Investigation Agency and has been a great resource to the committee. Next, we have Roy Houseman, who has also been a frequent guest, Legislative Director for the United Steelworkers. Then we will have Michelle Herek, Vice President of Ocean Policy for the World Wildlife Fund, who's joining us remotely, I believe. Hello. and then Rich Powell, the CEO of ClearPath. Your statements will be made a part of the record in their entirety, but I would ask if you could summarize in 5 minutes or less. And to help you keep track of time, please watch the timer in front of you, and I will notify you when your time has expired. Mr. Van Bismarck, please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the Ways and Means Subcommittee on Trade, thank you for inviting me to appear before the subcommittee today to discuss trade measures to protect the environment. I have investigated illegal trade in natural resources for nearly 3 decades, and my organization, the Environmental Investigation Agency, has presented evidence that helped instigate trade-based environmental measures, including the international ban on ivory trade, the timber annex to the Peru Free Trade Agreement, amendments to the Lacey Act, and recently the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. Well-chosen policies can bring transparency to trade that allows us to benefit from it. Without these policies, trade can make us unwitting supporters and dependents of crime and violence overseas and a loss of economic resilience at home. Mr. Chairman, the enforcement of existing measures, as you mentioned, is critical, but I'd like to take these 5 minutes to focus on what I think is the most important and tangible opportunity for policy that we have, and that is to pass legislation which can battle deforestation by requiring more transparency from commodity imports. Over the past decade, the world has lost an area of forest the size of Virginia every year. In the first 6 months of 2022, nearly 1 million acres of Amazon rainforest were destroyed, representing the highest deforestation rate since 2016. Forest loss is among the biggest contributors to climate change and biodiversity loss, and a root cause of zoonotic disease. Forests provide livelihood and food for over 1 billion people, but they are stolen from indigenous peoples and local communities by organized crime, feeding corruption and destabilizing nation states. The cause is primarily commercial agriculture overseas. Cattle and soy in South America and palm oil and pulp in Southeast Asia, for example, drive 60% of deforestation, and more than 2/3 of this occurs illegally. And resulting products such as palm oil, cocoa, and beef are commonly linked to forced and child labor. The U.S. is a major source of the demand that drives this destruction. As one example, we have recently become, we the United States, the second largest importer of Brazilian beef, which means under current conditions, we as Americans are financing illegal deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon and undercutting any cattleman or woman anywhere in the world that is playing by the rules. My organization is about to publish further evidence that car manufacturers in the U.S. are using leather coming from cattle linked to illegal deforestation. Both could easily be avoided if we created a level playing field requiring greater transparency about the actual origin of these products. The European Union announced last week their agreement on a new regulation on deforestation-free supply chains, and the UK is developing its own policy. This means the U.S. is threatening to lag behind and to offer a safe haven for commodities coming from illegally cleared land, leaving our farmers even more exposed to brutally unfair and globally destructive competition. The Bipartisan Forest Act has been introduced by the chairman and Congressman Fitzpatrick, and it takes this issue head on by prohibiting agricultural commodities produced on illegally deforested land from entering the U.S. market, requiring companies to carry out risk-based due diligence on commodities linked to deforestation, increase U.S. engagement with countries that reduce deforestation, strengthen legal tools to fight deforestation-related corruption and financial crime, and to give a procurement incentive for deforestation-free products. 50 environmental, faith-based, human rights, and anti-corruption NGOs have urged you to enact this legislation. The U.S. Cattlemen, the National Confectioners Association, and the Sustainable Food Policy Alliance, that's known North America, Mars Incorporated, Nestle USA, and Unilever United States, all support regulating this trade. Just recently, 181 financial companies representing $2.9 trillion wrote a letter of support for the Forest Act. At the 2021 Climate COP in Glasgow, the United States and China agreed to collaborate in support of eliminating global illegal deforestation through effectively enforcing their respective laws on banning illegal imports. This is the law that would make that statement meaningful and to send a signal to any country that the U.S. will not be a safe haven for commodities that destroy the future of both the global environment and law-abiding farmers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Houseman.
On behalf of the United Steelworkers and President Tom Conway, I wish to thank the Chairman Blumenauer and Ranking Member Smith for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Roy Houseman, and I'm the Legislative Director for United Steelworkers, and it's the largest union in energy-intensive, trade-exposed manufacturing like cement, steel, aluminum, and others. We have long been engaged on both trade policy and environmental policy because both are inherently economic policy impacting our members' jobs. Trade policy has impacted me personally. Trade was part of my work in the Alaskan fishing industry and in Montana making paper for export. Or when the 450 paper workers I labored with lost their jobs in part of previous congressional decisions related to trade. Because of that trade impact, Trade Adjustment Assistance, or TIA, aided me in retooling for my current career. These experiences in my union have educated me to believe that we must extend our nation's expectations of industry across our global commitments, while defending and bolstering our work against anti-competitive trade practices. Trade policy, if done correctly, must tackle more than tariff rates and market access. It is my hope that by going over some of the current initiatives and possible opportunities, it will aid the subcommittee's work in a bipartisan fashion to ensure this success. Looking first at global air and water policy, a recent Department of Commerce International Trade Administration report highlights both the challenges and the opportunities related to the global market for environmental good technologies and goods and services. The report notes nearly $700 billion in export potential for environmental goods and technologies, but also highlights a more ominous series of statistics. The lack of basic clean air and water services that communities and some of our largest trading partners experience today. My written testimony has several examples from the report, but one stuck out to me particularly. In Vietnam, 75% of industrial wastewater is being discharged into lakes and rivers without treatment. Congress needs to recognize that the third largest exporter into the U.S. is poisoning their citizens' air and waterways because corporations want to bring cheap goods to one of the largest consumer markets, the United States. This pollution needs to be considered an illegal industrial subsidy, and U.S. workers and their employers should not have to compete against environmental degradation without properly accounting for its cost. One way to do this is we need to allow workers, both domestically and globally, access to remedies against industrial polluters. For example, recent trade mechanisms in the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement must be extended to address bad actors and ensure foreign governments and multinational corporations treat communities with the same care we expect of our citizens. Indeed, the seeds of the USMCA's rapid response mechanism were sown in the U.S.-Peru FTA forestry annex. The union also strongly supports and urges passage of Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0, introduced by Representatives Sewell and Johnson from Ohio. Ensuring quick, responsive trade enforcement reduces the incentive to build excess, unproductive, and carbon-intensive manufacturing that is designed to steal market share from U.S. producers. Pivoting briefly to the steel and aluminum global arrangement negotiations between the EU and the U.S., we must ensure that serious limits are put on non-market excess capacity in carbon-intensive steel and aluminum products, while ensuring the U.S. industry is not threatened by a flood of imports from global competitors. This also goes for the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework negotiations. These efforts must recognize that a pairing of economic and climate policies requires action to ensure long-term job stability and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. The U.S. industry has and continues to invest heavily to limit air, water, land, and climate pollution to ensure our industry is among the cleanest in the world. We must ensure that IPAF countries meet or exceed these standards if they want access to our market. Finally, my written testimony highlights how little the U.S. spends on job training. For the USW, we try to keep our members working on the job. But when trade impacts happen, workers should have access to robust benefits to retool. We urge a renewal of TAA and support similar programs for energy-impacted workers too. Going forward, the Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee must diligently integrate environmental policy into trade policy. U.S. workers and manufacturers should not have to compete against goods made in jurisdictions that pollute and abuse their workers. Congress has the potential to promote fair global trade, retain good-paying union jobs here in the U.S., and uplift workers globally. Thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, sir. Next, we have Ms. Herek joining us remotely.
Good morning from central Vermont. And thank you, Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the subcommittee for convening this hearing today. My name is Michelle Herek, and I'm the Vice President of Ocean Policy at the World Wildlife Fund here in the United States. And we really appreciate your interest in looking for ways that trade policy can further sustainable natural resource management. Thank you for your leadership on the Bipartisan Forest Act and the IUU Fishing and Forced Labor Prevention Act. My testimony this morning is focused on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, commonly known as IUU, and forced labor in seafood supply chains. Just like the others, I've submitted a more extensive written statement on these issues that I hope you'll find useful. However, just like you heard from Mr. Bismarck, whether the commodity is a product from the forest or from the ocean, increasing its transparency, information around its production, and traceability requirements are key to addressing these problems. Seafood is the most highly traded food commodity with complex and opaque supply chains. The U.S. is the largest single country market for seafood in the world by value, with almost 85% of the seafood Americans consume being imported. So it's critical for the United States to show strong leadership to combat IUU fishing globally and increase transparency and traceability around fishing operations and attendant labor practices. IUU is a pervasive problem, and 1/3 or more of the global catch is estimated to be illegal. However, documentation and traceability gaps occur at many levels. At sea, where monitoring of fishing and labor are inadequate, in ports where systems of documenting catches are often weak, and in market states where systems to require traceability and proof of legal origin are lacking. Coupled with the financial incentives to fish illegally, such as subsidies, these gaps allow IUU fishing and forced labor to remain profitable with devastating effects. The U.S. International Trade Commission recently estimated that the United States imported approximately $2.4 billion worth of seafood derived from IUU fishing in 2019. By volume, China was estimated to be the largest source of IUU seafood imports, and many vessels from the Chinese Distant Water Fleet have been linked not only to IUU fishing, but also to labor abuse around the world. Well, there are already a number of tools used by the U.S. to address these problems, including, for example, the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, the Tariff Act, and other programs administered by state and the Department of Labor, and of course, provisions in trade agreements. Continued utilization of tools addressing the trade aspects of fisheries is needed. Trade agreements and initiatives like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, and the Taiwan Agreement provide the United States with opportunities to raise the standards for management and oversight of fisheries by requiring that countries meet the same standards as the U.S. for sustainability and legality by increasing transparency information and interoperable traceability requirements for fisheries. Although in many countries this will require technical assistance to support the needed fisheries and labor reforms. Trade initiatives and agreements should also ensure that partner countries comply with conservation requirements. New trade initiatives and agreements should also adopt the same labor standards that were included in the USMCA agreement, which has the strongest and most far-reaching labor provision of any trade agreement to date. As my time has nearly expired, I wanted to end by briefly summarizing some recommendations, although I've included details on these recommendations in my written statement, and I respectfully request you to that for further information about what can be done. But in summary, within the United States, these 3 steps should be taken. First, strengthen the seafood import monitoring program by expanding its coverage and have NOAA show that it's actually using the information collected and the program is having the desired effect by denying IUU market access. Second, encourage use of withhold release orders, like the action taken by the Department of Treasury just this past Friday against 157 Chinese vessels and individuals for IUU and forced labor. And third, promote cooperation really, with other countries and within the United States by requiring an all-of-government approach. As far as looking externally for trade agreements, 3 other quick ones. First, promote ratification and adherence to the new WTO agreement on fishing subsidies. Second, continue to require USMCA provisions from our trading partners and help them achieve the goals we set for them. And finally, strengthen the forced labor requirements whenever possible and use of applied sanctions as a result. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
And thank you for your testimony. Next, Mr. Powell.
Good morning, Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee. My name is Rich Powell, and I lead ClearPath. We advance policies to accelerate breakthrough innovations that reduce emissions in the energy and industrial sectors. Given this committee's vital role in America's energy trade policy and how that relates to the global climate challenge, I'll discuss 3 key topics today. First, we need to think globally and lead with American innovation. Second, we must unleash American energy resources and manufacturing. And third, we can lower global emissions and grow our economy by exporting clean energy. Look, the climate is changing, and global industrial activity is contributing. We hear that from heavy industry, energy, and agriculture. Everyone is clear. It's time to talk solutions. But far too often, energy and climate policy is oversimplified to false choices. Renewables versus fossil fuels, economy versus environment, emissions reductions around the world versus inaction here at home. These false choices ultimately cloud potential solutions. Here's the truth. We can invest in innovative emissions reduction technologies alongside improved trade policies. Ultimately, we need both. In 2022, estimated global investment in clean energy is a huge $1.5 trillion. The world expects U.S. leadership on clean energy, and trade is a critical piece. For instance, agreements like the USMCA promote American industrial standards abroad. These create the international economic conditions for clean technology while preventing a race to the bottom. Critical minerals are another example. The IEA estimates global demand for minerals for energy systems will quadruple by 2050 to hundreds of billions of dollars. Currently, China dominates that supply. Our dependence increases global emissions and handicaps American businesses. To attract industry back, we can't disadvantage American industry by saddling it with endless permitting, nor should we neglect resources like natural gas, geothermal, or nuclear energy. If we improve our ability to build and develop domestically, we could return manufacturing to the U.S., where production is more efficient and environmental performance is far superior to China and Russia. As Mr. Houseman noted, American steel, for example, has the 2nd lowest CO2 intensity globally. Yet America is still the world's largest steel importer. Increasing domestic steel production and exports are therefore strong climate policies. Getting the domestic policies right allows us to scale up our clean technologies by driving down costs. And we already have a model to follow, the hydraulic fracturing revolution, resulting from DOE-sponsored research, development, and deployment efforts. Now a $100 billion annual market, increased gas use has led the 20% U.S. emissions reduction since 2005. We should also accelerate American nuclear fuel production and expedite deployment of advanced nuclear energy. Today, we lead the world in advanced nuclear reactor patents, but Russia dominates uranium mining and enrichment capacity, limiting our full market potential. Nearly 50 countries have markets for advanced nuclear, and as Ranking Member Smith noted, but Russia and China currently account for about 2/3 of those reactors under contract worldwide. Another clean technology, geothermal, could power 10% of the country if properly tapped and lead numerous U.S. exports abroad. The U.S. is well positioned to lead globally in low-carbon hydrogen production from natural gas with carbon capture and from nuclear and renewable electricity. We made significant innovation progress recently. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act includes significant funding for energy programs originally authorized by the Energy Act of 2020. We know that with great investment comes great accountability. So ClearPath launched a tracker to follow the progress of these programs, which you can find at clearpath.org. Boston Consulting Group recently estimated the export market for key American clean energy technologies, including steel, hydrogen, energy storage, direct air capture, and advanced nuclear, could reach $330 billion annually by 2050 and enable 20 gigatons per year in global emissions abatement. To start, we should fast-track export permits to get our clean fuels to global allies. This year, U.S. LNG became a critical lifeline to Europe as they continue to wrench themselves from Russian gas. Just as importantly, a DOE life cycle analysis shows American LNG exports can be 30% cleaner than from Russian natural gas. The U.S. can also be a dominant exporter of clean hydrogen as Japan, South Korea, and the EU build it into their decarbonization efforts. On civil nuclear exports, Russia's aggression has other countries increasingly recognizing that building with Russia's state-owned Rosatom locks them into a century-long dependency. Thankfully, Eastern European countries are buying American. Poland signed up for several U.S. AP1000 reactors, and Romania plans to build NuScale SMRs. At $40 billion, the Poland agreement will be the largest clean energy deal on the planet in 2022. Today, Russia and China offer significantly stronger financing abroad. To remain competitive, we need a national strategic plan for nuclear exports as proposed by the recently introduced International Nuclear Energy Act, and better leverage from the Ex-Im Bank and the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. Finally, for years, the United States led negotiations on a high-standards environmental good agreement with the support of Representatives Brady, Smith, Delbene, and many others on this subcommittee. We must reopen that negotiation. An EGA would help open international markets to U.S. clean technologies by reducing their prices abroad, outcompeting China's Belt and Road. To address a massive global challenge like climate, no country will use a single clean power technology. Each will need to find the right mix given its national circumstances, resource endowments, and pre-existing industry. America can supply those futures. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Powell. I appreciate your reference to small-scale modular nuclear, which has its origin in the Pacific Northwest. A lot of potential there. Mr. von Bismarck, I'd like to begin the questioning portion by recognizing myself. We successfully worked to pass the Lacey Act amendments, which banned trade in illegally harvested timber and wood products and provided tools to keep illegally harvested timber out of the United States. And as you referenced, last week the EU reached a provisional political agreement on a regulation to address global deforestation driven by commodities such as cattle, cocoa, and palm oil, like the Forest Act. Would you have, could you describe for us the similarities between the EU regulation and the Forest Act and the efficacy of banning imports of commodity harvested on illegally forested land?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, the similarities are extensive. The EU regulation shares the same core actions as the Forest Act, which include focusing on the relevant commodities, and it has in fact chosen the same, more or less, commodities, the same scope that the U.S. legislation has. It focuses on mandatory due diligence with traceability in a risk-based system, in other words, from those locations where there is a great risk of deforestation. It then emphasizes cooperation with those countries to improve their actions to reduce deforestation and to provide the transparency information that U.S. companies would want in our case. I think it's a crucial moment, therefore, to follow suit. As I mentioned in my testimony, we don't want to be the place where the illegal deforestation commodities end up after Europe more effectively closes its doors. I think in terms of the efficacy of this type of legislation, I simply cannot think if one is concerned about deforestation globally, of a single step that the world could do other than to detach this connection between global trade and commodities from the destruction of the last great forests on Earth. That's what's causing it. And the United States, as one of the main consumers, has an extraordinary opportunity, with Europe moving at the same time, to harmonize that approach in a way that it is pragmatic, that it supports U.S. manufacturing and U.S. farming. So whether it's climate change or whether it's U.S. manufacturing with these commodities, I cannot think of a single policy that would be more effective at improvement as this one.
Thank you very much. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you to our witnesses. It's fascinating hearing the various data points that should concern a lot of folks. And I think it boils down to what can we do about some of these things? What will we do about many of these things? And so the fact that trade agreements have actually increased standards worldwide, I think, is an important point to discuss, and more specifically, USMCA being a great example of increasing standards, environmental especially, with a functioning dispute settlement system as well. So I would hope that we can build on the success of things like USMCA. I'm very concerned that the effective moratorium that the Biden administration has on trade is actually a missed opportunity. And so, Mr. Powell, you outlined in your remarks a bit about this. I was wondering if you see particular countries where there's near-term opportunities to actually make progress in terms of energy exports and cooperation on the environment.
Well, thank you so much, Ranking Member Smith, and thank you for your leadership on the Environmental Goods Agreement, on renewal of GSP, and on critical minerals, and ending U.S. dependence on Russian energy imports. There is so much opportunity globally. A very recent example, I had the pleasure to accompany a number of members, including Dr. Murphy, to the UN Climate Conference earlier this year, and to participate in a global summit of parliamentarians from around the world. And an Egyptian parliamentarian there told us almost plaintively, that Egypt wanted to build U.S. nuclear reactors to power its rapidly developing economy, but simply could not because the Russians had a much stronger offer on the financing front. The U.S. didn't bring the whole of the U.S. capabilities to that export, and we missed that opportunity in a critical region to supply U.S. technology and to build a century-long relationship with what could be a deep ally in the region. So I think whether it's across EMEA, across our many friends in Eastern Europe who are now attempting to disentangle themselves from Russian energy supply chains and build up their own domestic energy technologies, whether that's nuclear or further use of their fossil fuels with carbon capture technology, there's so much opportunity for very long-term trade relationships that would also lower global emissions.
Thank you. When you mention Environmental Goods Agreement, I think it's important to note that we have the resolution just introduced by Mr. Brady and Ms. Del Bene. Such an agreement, I believe, would create opportunities for U.S. workers, as you point out, to produce and export more of our products while improving the environment around the world. So can you elaborate more in terms of competitiveness and how that, additional opportunities to promote our actual competitiveness? I mean, whether it's steel and the quality and certainly the circumstances under which our steel is produced, and we want to be able to market that more, and we want to be more competitive, especially when other countries, let's face it, it's an unlevel playing field. So what are we going to do about it? How can we level the playing field and be more competitive?
It's certainly an unlevel playing field today, especially when you consider what we're up against with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So China brings to bear an all-of-government approach, which combines state-owned enterprises already heavily subsidized with multiple different export credit regimes and significant dumping in many industries, in overproduction in many industries to lower the cost of the goods. So that's what we're up against. I'm not proposing the United States take on China's centralized approach to all this, but we could do so much more to bring a whole-of-government approach to many of these things. That starts with things like the EGA. Our import tariffs are some of the lowest in the world, so we have very little to lose, for example, in an EGA that allows other people to lower their tariffs. So that starts by getting the barriers out of the way, and then we could do so much more to help facilitate our exports through better, more coordinated use of our various export credit groups. Many of them really operate like banks today, so they wait for people to come to them. There's not a single strategic vision of how the U.S. is going to, for example, push back on the Russian nuclear trade globally. Things like the International Nuclear Energy Act would set up the strategic plan to take that whole-of-government approach, and I think we need to do more like that across all of these industries.
How about a point-for-point comparison in terms of reducing carbon emissions, where we are, how far we've come, certainly, and definitely in comparison to these so-called competitors, like I say so-called, when it's such an unlevel playing field. So on the comparison of emissions, how would you speak to that, and how we can put more pressure for a level playing field?
The United States has spent hundreds of billions of dollars on emissions controls, both for things that increase efficiency and reduce carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, and just all the traditional environmental pollutants as well. So we've invested all of that into our industry. Many of our competitors haven't even started down that pathway, and so they're far more polluting industries. And today, we don't have any real way to monetize that advantage relative to all of our competitors. That should change. That should be a focus here.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Kine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the chairman for scheduling this very important hearing at a very important time, and the witnesses for your testimony today. Following on the heels of the historic passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the greatest investment our nation is making to reduce carbon emissions in our own country, 40% by 2030 alone. It was a huge first step, and I want to commend the chairman here for the leadership he's shown throughout the years of working hard to get core international labor and environmental standards embedded in the body of trade agreements with full enforceability provisions. I remember the work many of us on the committee did with the Bush administration, trying to convince them of the need to get these core standards in the body of trade agreement. What went wanting, though, was really the lack of strong enforceability provisions to follow up. It's one of the challenges we face. Most countries have pretty strong environmental laws and standards on the books, but getting them to enforce it is a whole nother matter. And Mr. von Bismarck, let me ask you about the importance of that. We reached a great bipartisan agreement with USMCA with strong enforceability chapter in it. Again, with Mr. Blumenauer's leadership, too, we have the Biden administration taking enforcement action on deforestation of the rainforest in Peru right now for the very first time. But how important is that in the enforceability of trade agreements to move this in the right direction?
Thank you. It's critically important. The application of that lever in the Peru Free Trade Agreement for Peru has been critical. The challenges absolutely continue, but as a result, the greatest flow of illegal wood out of the Peruvian Amazon was stopped in Houston Port, for example, and really shut down that entire trade. I think enforcement needs to improve, even with the mechanisms that were created. I think, if you have a free trade agreement and you agree to lower tariffs, then you should not use that as an excuse to move illegal goods into the United States, or to feel like you should, with that, also be able to hide the actual origin and the truth behind what's in those products. It appears that in the context of a free trade negotiation, the request to know what is coming into the country is a fair one. And I would maybe recommend that going forward, one even goes further along these lines, that information connected to the products coming into the United States, that should not be a secret. And I think
You've been very strong on that point for some time. And, Mr. Blumenauer and I just 2 months ago had the chance to go down to Colombia and Chile on a trade mission. And I think it's safe to say that we were impressed leaving Bogota with the renewed commitment that the new government has in protecting their large section of the Amazon rainforest and what they intend to do there with rural economic development, which was encouraging, I thought, during the trip. But Ms. Herek, let me ask you, Mr. Neal led a small congressional delegation to Geneva with the World Trade Organization earlier this year, too. Met with the new Director General, a lot of the ambassadors there. Obviously, we just had a fisheries agreement last June after 20 years of negotiation. Many might call it a de minimis agreement with a lot of things that weren't addressed, such as forced labor standards. Just how much attention should Congress be paying to the work being done at the WTO, given how hard it is for that organization to come to an agreement, especially on really key points. And again, during our visit to Colombia and Chile a couple months ago, we heard many of their complaints about illegal Chinese fishing right off their coast too, and also the forced labor implications of that.
Thanks very much for the question. I think that the WTO fisheries subsidies agreement is a starting point. I mean, it certainly doesn't answer all the questions, but the alternative, even in spite of the 20 years that it took to get to that point, is nothing. And that's certainly not preferable. Trying to collect this data to really understand how countries are utilizing, especially some of this harmful subsidy money when it could be redirected in such a much more beneficial way. And we know that China is the largest subsidizer, but they're not the only ones. And so the overfishing capacity that is fueled by these subsidies is really important. And it's a first step. We know there's more to be done, but this intersection between the environment and trade it's a tough one. It's not easy, and at least this shows that there is a willingness on the part of the WTO to try to make steps toward this and not give up. Which it felt like at some points in this negotiation, lengthy as it was, that might be the outcome.
Mr. Chairman, I see my time's about to expire, but Mr. Houseman, I do intend to follow up with you in light of the EU's intent to move forward on this new carbon adjustment mechanism that they've been talking about. We all need to be on the same page, so having an increased trade irritant may not be in either of ours best interests right now, but I'd be curious to get your feedback on that at some point. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kine. Mr. LaHood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses today for your valuable testimony on this important topic, promoting sustainable environmental practices through trade policy. Frankly, I wish we had had this 2 years ago or last year. You know, as everybody knows, we're on the cusp here, really the last opportunity to talk about trade before the Congress ends and the benefits of trade in Congress. And so I think I collectively, along with many of my colleagues, are frustrated that we haven't been able to move forward with bipartisan trade priorities this year, including, as has been talked about, the renewal of the Generalized System of Preferences, GSP, and miscellaneous tariff bill, MTB. It's been extremely frustrating and I think aggravating that we haven't been able to do that. And I think it'll come as no surprise that I remain concerned about the lack of a proactive, substantive trade agenda from the Biden administration. In her trade policy agenda hearing before this committee in March of this year, we heard many commitments from Ambassador Tai, including the quote, President Biden believes that trade can be a force for good that grows the middle class and addresses inequality if we can get the rules right, end quote. And here we are today still talking about those things. While I agree that the role of trade in supporting U.S. values, businesses, and workers, we have unfortunately seen an administration that is not engaged on, quote, getting the rules right through substantive trade policy. Lack of engagement in comprehensive free trade agreements and a lack of transparency in decision-making is what we have instead. It's unfortunate that USTR has not come to the Congress more frequently, instead pursuing trade policy through non-traditional and informal agreements and frameworks that skirt the need for congressional approval. While I think the topic of today's hearing is important, we have lost opportunities this Congress to include updated environmental policies to GSP in line what we have included in the USMCA. Additionally, we should be working to ensure that American-made clean energy does not face additional barriers to export. And with that, Mr. Powell, you talked a little bit about this in your opening, but a number of my colleagues have talked about the need for all of the above energy approach, which I also support. When it comes to U.S. opportunities for exports of clean energy, including nuclear energy, do you feel that we are taking full advantage of the global market today?
Well, thanks so much for the question, Mr. LaHood. Thank you for your long support for nuclear energy and more broadly for energy innovation through things like the Energy Sector Innovation Credit. It's hugely appreciated. We are certainly not taking full advantage of the market that exists today globally. Tragically, we have an opportunity with so many countries now having second thoughts, particularly about dealing with Rosatom and signing up to these long-term agreements with Russia. So we do have a real opportunity. I'm very pleased, I'll just reiterate how pleased we are about the U.S.-Poland agreement that was started in the last administration, finalized in this administration. It's an amazing deal that we're going to sell $40 billion worth of nuclear technology to Poland. That's a great first step, but we could be doing so much more. For example, in the previous administration, we removed the ban on financing for nuclear projects from the Development Finance Corporation. Good step in the right direction. There are still troublesome bans in other places. The World Bank in particular still has a ban on any financing of that sort of technology, and that could be so used and useful across, for example, developing sub-Saharan Africa, where there's significant interest in electrifying their economies with this decarbonized technology. So I think we could do more, both to use the Development Finance Corporation and those new authorities, which include potentially equity finance into deals to set these up around the world. South Africa, for example, has expressed strong interest in buying U.S. nuclear technologies as part of its efforts to clean up its grid. And we could be doing much more with our multilateral institutions. Realize that's a different committee's jurisdiction, but our multilateral institutions to pressure them to adopt a more all-of-the-above clean approach to development finance.
Well, I appreciate that, Rich. Just a follow-up question. You had referenced earlier the competition in Egypt between Russia and the United States. Can you talk a little bit about the quality of production between U.S. nuclear energy and Russia, for instance, and the efficiency and the effectiveness between the two?
So certainly our advanced technologies will outcompete Russian reactors. They have older style reactors. They're sort of battleship reactors. They've proven relatively reliable, so there's nothing to specifically worry about with Russian nuclear technology. What's much more worrying is about how they employ that technology geostrategically. It's almost like a virtual pipeline that they're putting to some other part of the world that they can't reach with a Gazprom pipeline to expand their influence. Because not only are they bringing turnkey financing with those deals, they then work in other security agreements around them. They often supply security forces to secure the reactors, which in some cases can mean the presence of Russian military on site. They're operating those reactors with Russian manuals, et cetera. So they really make a lot of dependency in those countries on continued engagement with Russia, which is, as we've seen, very problematic.
Gotcha. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. LaHood. Mr. Davis, remotely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to thank you for holding this very informative and important hearing. And I certainly agree that when it comes to global climate and the environmental changes, we must begin to speak the same language, or as Mr. Kine suggested, be on the same page. And I guess to me, it really means to have the same understanding of the problem. And in order to implement meaningful policy incentives and effective solutions, trade agreements is a good first step toward serving as one of the conduits to protecting the environment. Protecting land development is an essential factor towards preserving humankind and having a healthy life. Humans on the earth are alive because we inhale oxygen from the air, which helps run our bodily mechanism, and exhale carbon dioxide as a byproduct of the function of the body. The ocean, trees, and plants are the major sources for oxygen. So protecting the environment is critical to our existence. Mr. von Bismarck, in your testimony, you stated forest loss and degradation are among the biggest contributors to climate change and biodiversity loss, and are a root cause of zoonotic disease spillover events, such as those related to Ebola and coronaviruses. Could you further explain why we should take note of this potential health issue of diseases and pathogens, posing a global health crisis similar to the influenza zoonotic disease known as the Spanish flu of 1918 and the current lingering effects of COVID-19 on health security as well as economy. Could you delve into that a bit for us?
Thank you for the question. Well, forests mean an extraordinary amount of things to many people, and they provide what's called ecosystem services, which includes clean water, cycling of air, and the stability of the ecosystem that they contain. And in that part often comes the connection to potential disease outbreaks. Particularly lawless forestry and deforestation makes it extremely difficult for example, tropical countries to effectively manage a challenge of associated risks of disease with deforestation. And we're talking about lawless activity. So it doesn't even give you the opportunity to manage the situation. So you're losing the forest, you're changing ecosystem dynamics that run the risk of releasing disease, and you are reducing the ecosystem services that forest provides.
Thank you very much, and Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I want to thank all of the witnesses for their participation, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Dr. Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. 710 days. 710 days. That's the number of days that we have been sworn in the 117th Congress, and we have had 5 subcommittee hearings and 3 full committee hearings on trade. That's it. We are a global partner in a global economy, and we have been sitting idly by while the rest of the world advances. 8 days out of 710 has been our level of engagement as a committee in the trade world. That is anemic. That is something that is unacceptable, and quite candidly, it's just political malpractice. Each of you have made a comment about how important it is that we are engaged in a global economy to grow jobs and protect the environment, something that we can all agree on, something that we should be doing, and trade enforcement is important. But we have to be growing our presence around the world, and we have to be opening up new markets for many of our products. And thinking about where we are with GSP and MTB, the fact that we have not addressed that while there is wide bipartisan support, again, is malpractice. It's something that this committee should have already done, and the administration should have taken up already. The topic that we're talking about today is important. It's important to me as a Georgian because I look at the forest landowners and the timber producers in my great state of Georgia, and when there are illegal products that are dumped onto the market, it hurts us. And so we should be working on the enforcement mechanisms for multiple reasons. But we should also be expanding markets and looking at the things that we have done here in the U.S. to make our forests better, more sustainable, and to make our wood products better able to be exported around the world. We've mentioned conversations about dealing with energy in the European Union. We need to be talking about trade and with timber products into the EU. We need to be knocking down barriers so that American producers can export around the world. I believe that our strong economy is focused and should be focused on 3 major things. Number 1, having the right tax environment. Number 2, having the right regulatory environment, and having the right education environment. Doing all of those things to make America the most competitive place in the world to do business and making us the most competitive exporter globally. We should do this at a very, very high level. Unfortunately, we have been moving in the wrong direction, looking at doing things that actually make us less competitive around the world. We need to be focused on doing things that make American workers the most productive in the world by allowing investment in creativity and research and development. Then when this great nation produces a product, we need to protect that intellectual property at all costs. It's the one thing we do in America better than anywhere else in the world, which is to invent and innovate and solve the world's problems. And yet this administration continues with the World Trade Organization to dabble and give in a TRIPS waiver to give away the intellectual property for our COVID vaccines. That is absolutely wrong, and it's misguided. And it sets a dangerous precedent and a very slippery slope to begin to give away our intellectual property. We should protect it at all cost. We invented it. We've made the investment in it. Our companies are doing well in it. We need to sell that around the world. So I hope, and Mr. Chairman, you know, again, a very important topic, both in terms of protecting our markets and in terms of protecting the environment, something that we can all agree on. But let's not sit idly by while the rest of the world passes us by. 8 days of committee hearings, not a single markup in 710 days. And the rest of the world is moving past us. We cannot sit back. This committee has a responsibility and is charged with being engaged in trade practices. And I believe fully when we are in the majority that you will see a much different stance from this committee engaging on trade. And it's not at the expense of just, of enforcement. We should do everything. We should be expanding agreements. We should be expanding market access. We should be making this country more competitive. We should be protecting our intellectual property. We should be doing all of those things while we do enforcement. It's not one or the other. It's all of the above. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your commitment to make sure that our markets and our environment is protected. But let's make sure that we're doing everything that we can to grow the American economy in a sustainable way. Let's make sure that we are engaged early and often in trade agreements, and let's not have the anemic approach that we've seen over the last 2 years. It is important that we are leading the world in this regard. And for no other reason, pick an industry in your district, pick an industry in your state that's important, like timber is in mine, and let's find a way to make America not only the greatest country to do business, but the best export opportunity for our workers and our businesses around the country. That, yes, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Mr. Higgins?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important meeting today and your leadership consistently on this issue. The World Trade Organization and trade agreements are intended to raise living standards, create jobs, and improve lives. The core standards in most trade agreements are often very explicit, and they deal with primarily the environment and the economy. However, the enforcement of those core standards is often lacking. And you see it in the U.S., Mexico-Canadian agreement, and many others. And when you look at combining the resources, North America alone, that's about 500 million people. It's a lot of leverage. And the United States is the most advanced economy in the world, a $25 trillion economy, 70% of which is consumption. And, oftentimes when you look at the history of trade agreements, we're losers. And, 40 years ago when, China was competing with the United States, it was about T-shirts and tennis shoes and toys. Now it's about all of the complex manufacturing that the United States is engaged with. So just on the issue of enforcement mechanism, Mr. Houseman, can you speak of the importance of the enforcement mechanisms in these trade agreements and how they can be used for both environmental commitments explicit in the core standards of these trade agreements?
Thank you, Congressman Higgins. For the steelworkers, look, we're the most active union in trade enforcement. 1 in 4 anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases that have an order right now are with the support of the United Steelworkers because our members have been impacted in those communities. And that includes the multiple cases that we've brought forward on passenger vehicle light truck duty tires, including in your district, the Sumitomo plant, where we have about 1,000 USW members, and they've benefited from these strong enforcement provisions. It keeps people working. We've seen that company invest domestically into the facility there. And this is why we want strong enforcement. And this is why we also have concerns, for example, on the general systems preference. Right now, that tires aren't part of the import sensitive list. Steel is. The import sensitive list would not allow, for example, there's a 4% tariff that is permitted under the GSP to be lowered. And that impacts about 50,000 domestic workers. And you know, when you look at these anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases that we've supported, after that, the initial case against China, we saw over $3 billion of domestic investment from foreign transplants across the United States, plus at our facilities. So these sorts of enforcement provisions, both, you know, are traditional trade enforcement and in trade agreements, are super important.
You indicated in your opening testimony that you were a product of the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program. Again, a core standard in trade agreements, you know, particularly when the United States is involved, but there's very little money actually behind the concept of trade adjustment assistance. The United States lost 53,000 manufacturing businesses in the past 20 years, representing about 6 million workers. And these individuals were supposed to be retrained so that they could find employment that was commensurate with the employment that they had before the trade agreement. And if you look at all the statistics, particularly in the Midwest, you find that these individuals, that promise was not kept. The money was not there, the programs were not there, and the result did not achieve that equity that was promised. And not only does that exact financial cost on people in their lives, it's morally wrong as well. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, thank you. You know, look, DIA helped me get a Master's of Public Administration to allow me to do what I do now. And it's been a very beneficial program. I've had an opportunity to help certify over 12,000 workers into the program. I don't do it out of joy. I do it out of the fact that these workers need something at the worst time of their working lives, when they've lost their jobs. And it is one of the most robust training programs available for workers, period. And so that's why we're super supportive of that program, and why we think it's a useful model when we start talking about this energy transition, or, you know, and it is something that's going to be out there. The ability for workers to earn while they learn is something that's so valuable, and it really helps workers move forward. And that's why we've been supportive of this program in the short term. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Appreciate you referencing this critical program. It's not a political agenda. It happens to be something that is important for our American workforce, and in the past has enjoyed broad bipartisan support. And I'm appalled that we're not able to do that. We're holding these workers hostage. Mr. Estes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Smith, and thank you to all witnesses here today. You know, it's been 693 days since Joe Biden took the oath of office as president, and in those last 693 days, trade has taken a back seat to some hyper-partisan spending agenda that's fueled rampant inflation and wrecked our economy. CPI numbers came out again, and they still don't look good. Another month, we're over 7% inflation, 7.1% annual inflation is not something that we should be proud about. I was a little hopeful when I discovered that on day 693 of the Biden presidency, our trade subcommittee would be meeting, but instead of reauthorizing the Trade Promotion Authority or renewing the generalized systems of preferences and the miscellaneous trade tariff bill, we're talking about promoting environmental trade, which is important, but there's a whole lot of other issues that we should be talking about as well. But let's talk about trade and environment. Thanks to American ingenuity, our country has an abundance of clean energy and a potential for even more. In fact, new technologies have made drilling significantly cleaner than ever before. It's not something every oil-producing country can boast, which should be a compelling reason for us to get back to the policies that made our country a net exporter of cleaner energy just a few years ago instead of an energy importer. Ending the Biden administration's trade moratorium and war on American energy benefits us domestically. It lowers fuel and energy prices, improves our trade balance, and helps us export our cleaner energy instead of relying on dirtier energy imports. We also don't have to do this from our partisan camps. Republicans and Democrats agree that we should re-engage on negotiations on an environmental goods agreement, something that both parties have encouraged Ambassador Tai and the World Trade Organization to do. While it's unfortunate that the current administration has sat idle while other nations have advanced trade throughout the world, the United States can and should lead, and we could do so with bipartisan support. I've said that before. I've said that nothing has brought more people out of poverty around the world than free and fair trade. And I believe that trade, when done right, can also help us conserve our resources and advance clean energy policies. Mr. Powell, you and your organization have extensively researched clean energy production. What are some of the most significant advances you've seen in clean energy production in the last decade, and how could these advances help us globally if we have an environmental goods agreement that allows for more free and fair trade?
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Estes, and thank you for your continued leadership here on this committee on these important issues. You know, I think I mentioned this in my oral testimony. I described it a little bit more at length in my written testimony, but we should remember that the fracking revolution in the United States has brought unbelievable both economic and environmental benefits here domestically, and is allowing us to play in a completely different way in global trade and energy products. So just a quick reminder, that was not something done entirely by the private sector. That was actually a grand public-private partnership between the Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy, working on deep innovation in a number of new technologies, 3D seismic imaging, horizontal drilling, hydraulic fracturing, diamond-headed drill bits, combined cycle natural gas turbines, all of these things. And it combined, that allowed us to have a new technology which could hugely increase domestic gas production at much lower cost, and then that allowed us to heavily decarbonize our power sector here in the U.S., leading to an overall 20% increase. That's the world-leading decrease in greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, and to become now the leading global exporter of this technology, so we can actually push back against Russian aggression. There's no reason we can't repeat that feat across multiple additional technologies. The Energy Act of 2020, a very bipartisan piece of legislation, set up a moonshot to try to repeat that feat across advanced nuclear energy, across fossils with carbon capture, across advanced geothermal energy, and long-duration energy storage systems. The Department of Energy is now hard at work to implement that program and demonstrate those technologies, and I'm very hopeful that at least a few of those will pan out, and we'll have even more technologies like that that are both better performing and lower cost, and significantly cleaner than the things that they're displacing. That'll help us, obviously, here domestically, and even more importantly, we'll be able to export those technologies around the world.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, the look at an all-of-the-above energy approach is going to allow us to have more cleaner energy sources and to be able to utilize that, and also allow us to unleash that energy innovation that comes out of the United States that we can export around the world and help us with trade. So thank you for your time, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Estes. Mr. Panetta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, ma'am, thank you very much for being here, and as well as your expert testimony. Just to kind of lay out my outline, Mr. Powell, I'm going to start with you and then hopefully get to Ms. Herek in regards to some IUU questions. Mr. Powell, look, as you know, we've made some historic investments recently with some pretty monumental legislation that will hopefully reduce our carbon emissions by 40% below the 2005 levels by 2030 is what we're hoping for. Now, as you know, I've been a supporter of tech-neutral credits, especially with my sponsorship and authorship of the Energy Sector Innovation Credit, the ESIC, with former member Tom Reed, which I'd want to thank you and ClearPath for obviously your help on that legislation, but also, more importantly, your commitment to energy innovation. And some of those tech-neutral credits ended up in that recent legislation. And I believe that it is that legislation, through those types of credits, that will spur new technologies, not just here in the United States, but hopefully and possibly in the rest of the world. Now, unfortunately, many of those new technologies will face some pretty steep tariffs, as we know. And the WTO, they worked previously on an environmental goods agreement to reduce those tariffs, but as we know, it stalled in 2016. That's why I'm so proud to have members like Representative Del Bene to my right and Ranking Member Kevin Brady, their environmental goods agreement resolution, which encourages U.S. to re-engage in an EGA at the WTO and reduce barriers on environmental goods trade. Mr. Powell, in your view, what are the most important outcomes of an environmental goods agreement?
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you as well for your long partnership with the Energy Sector Innovation Credit and supporting an all of the above innovation-focused approach. If you look at the various technologies that were included in ESIC, for example, a number of those were already included in the last round of negotiations on an EGA, so things like advanced carbon capture-linked gas turbines, geothermal systems, et cetera. A number of the things in ESIC were not yet included in that, in part because maybe they just weren't realistic yet. With yesterday's amazing announcement of progress on fusion technology, for example, at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in your great state, we should be thinking ahead to establishing a regime where both advanced nuclear technologies and potentially one day fusion technologies would be covered in that. Really, we should be thinking of an all-of-the-above clean approach and make sure that really no advanced clean energy technology is taken off the table as we renegotiate that agreement.
Now, as we look towards these types of clean technologies, we're going to be relying on critical minerals and rare earth elements, obviously. Unfortunately, right now, or at least previously, we put a pause on our investment in that. And China has basically filled that vacuum, clearly. Our supply chain, the supply chain when it comes to rare earth elements is dominated by China. What can we do to reduce our dependence on and expose basically Chinese critical mineral supply chains? What can we do to basically make sure that we fill some of that vacuum as well?
Well, we need to focus both on domestic extraction, domestic processing, and friendly extraction, processing, and trade for all this. For better or for worse, the long pole in the tent for domestic extraction and for domestic processing is a permitting reform issue. So this is not an issue where we need to do more to support these industries. This, unfortunately, is an issue where we need to get government out of the way or get government into a more constructive posture. It's extremely difficult to permit and license a new mine in this country. It's also extremely difficult to permit and license a new processing facility for one of these critical minerals, and we need to fix that permitting regime if we're going to be realistic about scaling this up in the U.S.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Powell. Ms. Herek, thank you for your testimony today. Unfortunately, you're not here. Fortunately for you, you're in, I think you said Vermont. Hopefully it's maybe a little warmer than it is here in D.C., but I doubt it. In regards to IUU, obviously you mentioned that there's a $22 billion in subsidies that's contributing to overfishing and IUU fishing. Could cutting subsidies to IUU fishing change the dynamic that we face right now and reduce it? And if so, how can we go about enforcing that?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Representative Panetta. It's estimated that more than half of the distant water fishing operations that are operating today are doing so only because they can rely on subsidies. Otherwise, they'd be unprofitable. So part of taking those harmful subsidies out of the picture reduces the sheer volume of vessels that are out there chasing the fish. And that's part of the problem, that there are just too many of those. They're taking too much. And so when we talk about enforcement, I mean, obviously there's a real role for that to try to make sure that when we have the agreement in place, and we need to encourage ratification of that agreement at the WTO, but to try to make sure that this information is transparent, it's publicly available, so we can utilize it to reduce the number of fishing vessels that are out there, especially those that wouldn't be out there but for their reliance on subsidy money. And then to make sure that when we think about enforcement, because there's been a lot of talk about enforcement here today, that it's strong, it's robust, it's an important part of what we can do. So we have to promote it when we do it so the industries know and the countries know that we mean it, but also to think more broadly about it and not make it just transactional, not just take one vessel for one trip off the water. Really think about how to deny the ongoing flow of illicit money that keeps these operations moving, how to stop that, how to cut it off before they build another vessel, before they launch somebody else, they start another processing plant up. And so really thinking about how to curtail that aspect of the trade flow as well is important.
Thank you. Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Panetta. Ms. Miller?
Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer and Ranking Member Smith. I, too, share the same frustration that my colleagues do about the lack of focus that we have had here and lack of action on working on trade. It's so nice of you all to be here, and particularly you, Mr. Powell. It's nice to see you again. The United States is a leading partner of energy worldwide, and our standards are the highest, and the power is the cleanest anywhere that you look. I have long been an advocate for expanding American energy exports to support our communities, strengthen our interests around the globe, and lower our emissions across the world. All of these are possible with a good trade policy that prioritizes the United States energy producers. The U.S. natural gas is much cleaner than gas produced anywhere else in the world. According to the United States Department of Energy National Laboratories, Russian natural gas exported to Europe has a life cycle emission profile over 40% higher than the United States LNG exports. If Europe switched its current supply of Russian natural gas to the United States LNG, the world would avoid over 70 million tons of emissions every year. This is why I founded the bipartisan Congressional Energy Export Caucus, and I have my friend and colleague on this subcommittee, Jody Arrington, also as a co-chair. Our caucus is committed to exploring the solutions of American energy issues, advocating for all of our energy producers' interests, and building bridges with our international partners and allies. For these efforts to be successful, we need an administration that is committed to working with Congress on comprehensive trade policy. To date, this administration has been asleep at the wheel. We need to be working on authorizing trade promotion authority, renew generalized system of preferences, including the environmental standards that are based on the USMCA language, and the miscellaneous tariff bill to boost U.S. competitiveness. Congress should also explore renewing the environmental goods agreement to focus on exporting reliable, clean U.S. energy and technology. In order to accomplish any of these goals, Congress, and I repeat, Congress must be involved in any negotiations and authorizations. Mr. Powell, thank you for coming to speak to us today. The work ClearPath does is so important. Can you talk about the importance of maintaining baseload energy for reliability of our grid?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. It's great to see you, and thank you for your continued leadership across the Energy Exports Caucus, your work on permanent 45Q for carbon capture, your co-sponsorship of the Energy Sector Innovation Credit, everything you're doing in this space. Baseload energy, flexible energy is absolutely essential if the U.S. is going to maintain our competitive advantage as both a low-cost and very clean supplier of electricity to our industry, so that we can bring more industry back to the United States. This year, for the first time, tragically, we saw multiple different energy systems across the U.S. announce significant concerns that we'd have serious grid reliability issues, in part because we've seen so much premature retirement of baseload and flexible energy-generating technologies across our country. New England, for example, is very much not out of the woods. There could be a very rough winter ahead given the lack of resources in their electricity supply. So this is just absolutely vital that we find ways to maintain those baseload resources while continuing to reduce their emissions.
You know, my state is so rich in natural resources, between the timber, the natural gas, the coal, the oil. It's hard for me to really comprehend why we put ourselves in this position. The U.S. lifting the oil and gas export ban resulted in our ability to help Europe keep the lights on during their current crisis. With the United States at nearly full export capacity, what are the major hurdles to exporting our energy products to both Europe and the other allies around the world?
Well, if you take LNG, for example, we need to continue to permit more LNG export facilities. We're basically doing everything we can with the existing facilities. We saw how important any individual facility was when the Freeport natural gas export terminal went down due to that explosion earlier this year. So we need to license more of these, get more of these built and constructed. Part of that also means working with our allies on the other side to make sure that they're inking long-term offtake deals to actually allow our companies to set up and export these things. These are such large industrial facilities. It's very difficult to trade on the spot market and get finance for that. So we really need to be working with the French and the Germans, et cetera, to take long-term certain deals for them.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Ms. Dobeni, we deeply appreciate your continued interest in environmental goods, your recent action, and welcome your comments and questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today on this important topic. Mr. Houseman, I wanted to start with you and thank you for your ongoing efforts to advocate for workers in critical industries like steel and aluminum. You well know the ongoing challenges we faced in the Pacific Northwest as our once widespread aluminum industry, which was powered by union workers and renewable energy, has continuously been undercut by production in foreign countries like China with much lower environmental and labor standards. China now produces 57% of the world's aluminum in comparison to the United States' 2%. In 2020, the last aluminum smelter west of the Mississippi River in my district, in an economic hub in Ferndale, Washington, closed its doors and laid off 700 union workers. Now, at least at the time, trade adjustment assistance was available. The assistance that we had fought for was still active, and these workers were able to access critical resources to retrain and regain full employment. This program has been fully expired since July of this year. So not only must we renew this program, but enhance it so that more workers can bounce back from job loss and continue to provide for their families. In the longer term, one way to respond to these pressures in our trade policy is to account for carbon intensity. Our trade policy should reward strong labor and climate practices, not undercut them. The Biden administration is leading this effort with the European Commission by negotiating a sustainable steel and aluminum agreement. And so, Mr. Houseman, I wondered, what are the key elements that we should consider when developing these new trade rules?
Thank you, Representative Delbene. For the USW, look, we worked in a tripartite fashion with the Biden administration and industry to ensure that the 232 arrangement with the EU move forward. And as such, that global arrangement discussions are so important to ensuring that we have we limit non-market capacity, but also carbon-intensive capacity. Because if you look at, for example, in steel, right now in the Indo-Pacific region, over 90 million tons of new steel capacity is getting put in, primarily blast furnace technology, and that technology, if done right, can be pretty low carbon, but if not done right, which Chinese investment is primarily going in there, it's going to explode carbon emissions in that region by 3 times. So things like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, when their decarbonization pillar and the global arrangement pillar are designed to try and create some opportunities to leverage down those emissions, while at the same time creating that opportunity to lift up domestic production, where, like, for example, in El Talco, we have this opportunity here. You have a smelter that just needs that investment and a little bit of TLC, and you could start making primary aluminum. We really need that in our country. The last primary smelter that could make high purity aluminum just went down this last year, and that was the last in the NATO region. Now, when you think about that dependence on aluminum, and that's, for example, why we've been advocates of banning Russian aluminum imports into the U.S., in part because we see this opportunity here to restart domestic production, not just limit imports coming into the U.S., but also try and limit those imports that are going to third-party countries. So there really is a lot of opportunity here. We've seen our domestic smelter capacity drop dramatically with China's rise in aluminum production. And I think that these are the global arrangement combined with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework have that opportunity to kind of balance that leverage to allow us to step forward.
Thank you. And then I just wanted to comment, many folks have already brought up the environmental goods agreement and the resolution that Ranking Member Brady and I introduced. This resolution states the United States should work with partners with high labor and environmental standards to increase export opportunities for American-made environmental products. And so we'll continue, and I appreciate my colleagues commenting on that as well today. Thanks so much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Delbeni. I see Mr. Arrington appears to have joined us. Would you seek recognition?
Well, I would love to.
Is that why you're here?
I am here as a member of this subcommittee. And if it's okay with you, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a few remarks.
The floor is yours for 5 minutes, or 4 minutes and 55 seconds.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate it. Well, I was interested in reading the title of today's hearing, Promoting Sustainable Environmental Practices Through Trade Policy. There's a lot we agree on with respect to trade, or we wouldn't have been able to do a comprehensive free trade agreement with our two largest trading partners, Canada and Mexico. So there's clearly consensus, but I would say you can't promote anything through trade if you don't prioritize trade. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but some of the most benign and bipartisan provisions in trade that needed to be renewed, like GSP and MTB and TPA, have not. They've expired. There's been, in my opinion, from this administration, certainly no leadership in this area. I don't think not only what happens in that scenario is not only do we not make progress, I think we go backwards, and I think the failure to enforce trade agreements has become a problem. Not to mention some of the systemic problems at WTO. So there's just been a gigantic void in anything leadership on trade. So I mean, it'd be nice to talk about all the things that you could do through promoting trade if you were making trade a priority. I think the first thing we ought to do with trade is the core principles of trade, which is expanding commerce, expanding economic opportunity for Americans and for our trading partners, and expanding prosperity and having the boats rise on that tide, all boats, all manufacturers, all producers, American workers. But that's not happening, and it's unfortunate. And I think the second thought I have with respect to environmental practices being promoted through trade is, and the sustainability of stewarding the environment is, I'm worried about the sustainability of the American worker and American families, and the 7 out of 10 Americans living paycheck to paycheck who can't put gas in their cars, who can't heat their homes. And I know there are global dynamics in supply and demand. I know there's a global market, and I don't think Vladimir Putin is the only reason we've seen the spike in energy prices. And this is a real concern, and it's an even bigger concern for our allies. What I find very concerning, to say the least, are our own self-inflicted wounds to an industry, namely oil and gas, that have blessed us as the lifeblood of our economy, the greatest in the world, and a very critical asset in geopolitics and national security. Mr. Powell, I guess my first question with respect to that is it Vladimir Putin's fault? Is it OPEC's fault? Is it Venezuela, who we're asking to help us bail us out? By the way, I read where their methane emissions in Venezuela are 700 times higher than the United States. I mean, it's not like we don't lead in environmentally friendly and sort of mitigated environmental impacts of producing fossil fuels. It's not like when we don't produce them, the demand goes away. Someone else supplies that demand, and they generally don't have our standards. And so it generally affects the global impact, which is, I think, the real measuring stick if you care about emissions. But I guess the first question, Mr. Powell, is our whole of government hostility in this administration towards fossil fuels, is that affecting domestic consumer prices? Or is it just some existential force that's hard for us to get our arms around and define and explain to the American people?
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman. I think it really points to the importance of thinking about the emissions challenge globally, right? So if we are the cleanest producers of oil and gas in the world, and we are among the cleanest producers of oil and gas in the world, the thing to do to reduce global emissions is to increase our share relative to the rest of the world. Tragically, Vladimir Putin's actions offer us an opportunity to do that, and we should be doing everything we can to seize that opportunity, increasing our
I want to thank
exports
the
and
witnesses, all of you, for being here. I look forward to working with you in the next Congress and putting America trade as a priority for this country, and working with my Democrat colleagues as well. I think we all have a desire to do that. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Arrington. Mr. Schneider, virtually?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Well, it's good to be here. And Chairman Blumenauer, I want to thank you for holding this hearing. And as we come to the end of this 117th Congress, thank you for your leadership. I think one thing we can all agree across the board, across the aisle, is that we share a common goal of growing our economy, creating more and better career opportunities for all Americans, for raising the standard of living and securing the future for our children and our grandchildren. There are few greater threats, maybe no greater threat to that future than the effects of climate change, having here on the U.S. and around the world. And I'm incredibly proud of the work we have done, especially on the Ways and Means Committee, to tackle this problem under the leadership of House Democrats. With the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, we have now made the single largest federal investment to fight climate change in U.S. history. We invested in clean energy, created robust incentives to help our transition to a green energy economy for the future. And I'm proud that the Inflation Reduction Act reflects not just our biggest investment, but that 70% of that investment is through the tax code. Among those initiatives is legislation I have helped champion, the Sustainable Skies Act, which will boost the production of sustainable aviation fuel. But no matter how much we invest at home, we can't tackle the crisis alone. It is a global economy and it requires global action. Interconnected supply chains, American trade policy, therefore must promote collaboration among all of our partners and while holding the economy to a high environmental standard, work to make sure that we are improving everybody's lives around the world, but in particular here in the United States. Let me start with Mr. Bismarck, but as we look at trying to address these goals and the need to work together, especially ideas such as friendshoring in combination with onshoring many of the manufacturing we're trying to do, do you have thoughts of how we can avoid the zero-sum game too many people want to play, that it's us versus them, but in fact the idea that we're all in this together?
Thank you, Congressman. Yeah, I think it goes to the issue of transparency. Trade does not have to be destructive if we know what it is, if we know what is behind the products that we are exporting and importing. So I think in an effort for it not to be zero-sum game, we have to know what's behind it. And currently the technologies, the abilities to know what is behind a manufactured product, what is behind the commodities that are produced around the world, indeed what is behind natural gas, has greatly increased. And I think we need to catch up to what is possible in the information age of knowing what is actually behind trade. It can be reasonable, we can look at each sector and say what is possible today without being onerous, but we have to catch up.
Right, thank you. And let me try to pull that together. As I mentioned, sustainable aviation fuel is a part of the Inflation Reduction Act, or support for it. Globally, aviation accounts for more than 2.5% of greenhouse gas emissions. SAF has potential to reduce that by more than 50%. To any of our witnesses, would welcome your thoughts on steps we can do within negotiating trade agreements to try to make sure we're doing all we can to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the aviation industry.
This is Roy Houseman with the Steelworkers, and thanks. This is a really important question, and particularly for our membership, where 2/3 of domestic refining capacity is represented by United Steelworkers. And we've seen the opportunities with sustainable fuel aviation, and there is an opportunity here moving forward to look at how our current fleet of refiners are able to produce those products going forward. Right now in California, one of our refineries is going through a process of transitioning to traditional fuels to sustainable fuels. And in part, those sustainable credits and others are going to be one of the ways that we move that forward and allows us to advance both domestic production, but also creates the tools for possible export potential in the future. But we also have to prepare for the impacts. That facility is reducing its manning count by almost 500 people. And that's why we think it's important to incorporate not just the efforts to expand production of things that we want to see advance, but also the ability to ensure that workers aren't adversely impacted as well.
Thank you, and I agree with you on that point. I wish I had more time, but my time has expired. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for having this hearing. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Schmucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you holding this hearing. A lot has been said, I think, about trade as a force for good. I think we all understand the impact of trade, impact of markets across the world, opening markets across the world, impact on our quality of life, standard of life, and prosperity for our nation and people around the world. We've also talked, and I appreciate this, about the idea of trade being used as sort of a leverage point to ensure that we are promoting sustainability practices and that we are being good stewards of our environment. And then, we hear about GSP not being renewed, and this literally is working against that goal. I believe there are, we've talked about U.S. companies, particularly in the energy sector, being leaders in producing energy cleaner than in other areas of the world. And I think that's true for U.S. companies as well. They often lead the way in creating their products in a more sustainable manner and relying on renewable energy. And I have an example of that. My staff just talked to a company in Pennsylvania, Crayola, which I think most of us recognize the name, but they are a great company in Easton, the far eastern part of Pennsylvania, not in my district, but close by. And they're an economic driver in the region as well. But they, by the way, manufacture more than 3 billion crayons per year, 750 million markers. But they told the story, and this illustrates the point that I just made, that through GSP, they were able to save a lot on tariffs, and they took that money and converted all of their U.S. facilities to be 100% powered by renewable resources. They also have extended that down their supply chain. Colored pencils they don't produce here, but they're produced at a facility in Brazil. And even the suppliers there are carbon negative. And they talked about, if we don't renew GSP, they will need to look at some of their operations. It's basically pitting those sustainability standards also against their commitment. They don't want to increase prices for their customers, and particularly in an inflationary environment. These are tough decisions that they have to make. And so the point I want to make is, I think renewing GSP will allow that manufacturing that is occurring here in Pennsylvania and other places across the country to continue to clean their operations. And so it's working against the goal of being sustainable. And then, of course, the very legislation that has been introduced to renew GSP updates the environmental eligibility criteria. That legislation has already passed the Senate with bipartisan support. Ways and Means Republicans have introduced the legislation. So I really don't understand, Mr. Chairman, why this isn't being taken seriously by the administration, and why we would not want to renew GSP, which threatens American jobs and threatens that sustainability that we're working towards. So, Mr. Powell, we've heard a lot about this today. So I'm just curious, your thoughts. Can you detail how our delay in renewing GSP will drive up the cost of sustainability and help China at the same time?
Well, thank you so much, Congressman. As a proud Pennsylvanian myself who grew up going to that Crayola factory, I'm very proud of what they've done with that. I think it does speak to the broader issue of U.S. competitiveness and wanting to use our trade policy to do everything we can to make our companies as competitive as possible so that they continue to make these great investments in clean energy. I think more broadly, as you noted, the environmental standards in the updated GSP have been significantly expanded. One in particular points to making sure that our counterpart countries are in full compliance with the Montreal Protocol, which reduces ozone-depleting substances. The Montreal Protocol was just significantly updated via the Kigali Agreement. Implementation of that was part of the Energy Act of 2020, signed into law in a very bipartisan way. It was just ratified over in the Senate that we're going to phase out these HFC sort of super GHG chemicals. And so I actually think GSP is a powerful new tool to help make sure that other countries are coming along with us on that journey to phase out HFCs globally. Yet another thing to make our companies more competitive here.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to sit in on your subcommittee. As one of the negotiators on the USMCA working group for the Ways and Means and the Democratic Caucus with the Trump administration, I got to see firsthand how difficult addressing any kind of environmental concerns can be. My job was on the labor provisions, and I thought that was tough, but the environmental provisions proved, I think, even tougher. And I know that although the labor chapter was pretty innovative, it did build off of some environmental enforcement mechanisms that were in the Peru timber annex. That's what I call the rapid response or rapid enforcement mechanism for labor violations was addressed. I'm just curious of how we can continue to strengthen provisions within trade agreements, bilateral agreements or multilateral agreements that will give the United States as well as people who care about the environment and seeing what kind of provisions that we would like to see. I know that we changed some of the language where we changed the burden of proof of a violation, that we had to prove a violation occurred, to they had to prove that it didn't occur, which was a big step forward and just kind of having language that became more enforceable. Mr. Houseman, can you comment on any of the lessons learned from the facility-specific rapid response mechanism for labor rights enforcement, and how might it be useful model to consider for environmental obligations as well, even also take into account the lessons learned from the Peru timber annex mechanism?
Yes, thank you, Representative Gomez. For the steelworkers, having this ability to have facility-specific action has really, and you look at the 6 RRM cases in USMCA, has really allowed several thousand workers to form independent unions and raise wages significantly more so than the company-controlled unions did in the past. And so, it's a very useful model of being able to go in, target bad actors, and ensure that there's that ramp up of pressure. And so, we see this as a possible really useful model when we look at the fact that you have, globally these issues related to, like, for example, Vietnam with the lack of industrial wastewater pollution, where you could potentially target specific facilities to encourage and uplifting and reducing water, air emissions, and those sorts of items. So, this is the same with the Peru, the Peru annex. You had this opportunity here where we were able to block wood imports, and that really forced a realignment by the sector to try and reduce illegal logging and force governments to action. And I think one of the key things here is, there's really an undercurrent here, is that when you look at CAFTA, that was signed in 2004. It was pre the iPhone. We have updates on our iPhone for security every 6 months, yet we haven't really updated our trade enforcement regimes to be more as responsive. And in a perfect world, we have them as responsive as private industry is trying to keep your security on your phone. So like this is one of those opportunities that I think that we have to kind of look at, and it took a lot of leverage. Let's face it. Like we almost, the previous administration was threatening to withdraw from a 20-year-old trade agreement to make some of these advancements. But it also took a bipartisan effort here in the House and Senate to upgrade those mechanisms to ensure that they were useful for labor and for the communities that are now kind of benefiting from the USMCA.
Thank you so much. Mr. Bismarck, same question. Since your focus has been on deforestation, are there lessons learned from USMCA, from the Peru free trade, the Peru timber annex that we can apply to other regions of the globe in order to enhance environmental policy in areas that we might not have as much influence over?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, I mean, the history of the battle over the last few years of better governance in the forests in Peru is one that is incredibly grateful for the influence of that mechanism, of the Peru annex. There are many communities and indigenous people in Peru who were depending on the leverage that came with that annex to protect hard-fought gains in governance, hard-fought gains of creating entities in Peru that had independent oversight over illegal logging, these kind of things that came under incredible attack. So the effectiveness was shown. In terms of improving that going forward, I really appreciate the point about the cell phones just made by Mr. Houseman. We now have the ability in some countries to real-time track logging trucks, to allow citizens to be part of enforcement by using an app. This is about to be implemented in Gabon. It has been implemented in Romania. There is such a new level of information that could be connected to the enforcement mechanisms that have been created to really elevate them. So I would focus on forcing also enforcement agencies on the other side of these agreements to actively exchange information to allow these kind of cases that require information from both sides to effectively come forward.
No, that was a great point when it came to using the technology of today, making sure that that information is transmitted to agencies on both sides of an agreement. One of the things that I want to see is, as I mentioned in a conversation with officials, USTR, is that I want to see a ratcheting up of cases to be enforced when it comes to the labor enforcement mechanism.
Thank you, Mr.
In some
Gomez, for
respects, we
joining
need to
us.
give more resources to USTR to be able to do that. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I couldn't see if my time was up or not. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our witnesses for being with us. I just reflect for a moment on some of the progress we've made. The Biden administration inherited, let's just say, a troubled landscape in terms of trade, declaring our allies in Canada as national security threats, trying to repair those frayed relationships, getting the agreement, for example, to end the aircraft wars, and the spirit with which we tried to implement the USCMA. I would note that the area that is hung up for some of my colleagues on the Republican side, they refuse to agree in terms of the GSP that we put forward, is consistent entirely with what we agreed to on a bipartisan basis in that agreement with Canada and Mexico. And I hope that before we leave that people will agree to take yes for an answer for something that we've agreed upon and not hold it hostage and move it forward. I am hopeful that we are able to keep the spirit that we had with the USMCA of not leaving people behind, which is why enforcement was key to getting that agreement and why I hope the administration is more aggressive in enforcement now to be able to show good faith with American industries and workers. And last, I would just conclude by saying that the trade adjustment assistance recognizes that not all people share in the benefits of trade, and that there are some that pay the price. And that legislation was an effort to try and help people left behind. And it is exactly what is necessary for us to avoid getting into more trade wars. I came into this position committed to trying to deal with things that brought us together rather than divide us. And I hope that both the GSP and the trade adjustment assistance would be an example of that, so that we are able to share in the benefits and not bogged down in what I think are unnecessary partisan battles. But I appreciate our witnesses. I appreciate the commitment to trying to move forward to protect the environment and the notion of what we're going to do going forward. And I look forward, I think there's going to be a switch in control, and I look forward to being as cooperative with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle as they have been with us. In fact, maybe even exceed it in terms of progress, because the stakes are very high for what we're talking about, and we do agree on so many of the fundamental principles. Members will have 2 weeks to submit written questions with the permission of our witnesses to be answered later in writing, and those questions and your answers will be part of the record. And again, thank you for joining us. We deeply appreciate it, and our hearing is adjourned.